Hello and welcome. So in this lecture video, I'm going to continue my discussion of this problem and also looking at the contribution margin ratio and then some additional applications of cost volume profit analysis. Okay. So if we look at this problem, remember RBC sold 430 bikes and we're looking at these same assumptions that the price per bike stays the same, variable cost per unit stay the same, contribution margin per unit stay the same. And we want to know what would be net operating income if we sold 430 bikes. So there, like I was saying in the prior lecture video, there's a couple different ways to solve this problem. The first one is to do a whole income statement, which is kind of using the profit equation, which I'll talk about here in a second. So to get sales, I multiplied 500, which is the sales price per bike, times 430 bikes gives me $215,000. 300 of variable expenses per bike times the 430, 129, subtract it, 86,000 is contribution margin, minus the $80,000 of fixed expenses gives us the net operating income of 6,000. The other way that you could have done it, so this is first way. The other way that you could have done it, I'm kind of labeling these in terms of 1, 2, and 3 in terms of difficulty. This way is probably the easiest. The second easiest would have been to say, okay, I know that my sales price stays the same. I know my variable expenses stay the same. Therefore, my contribution margin per unit also stays the same. I can multiply my contribution margin per unit times the 430 units. That would give me a total of $86,000 in contribution margin. Then I subtract out my $80,000 of fixed expenses because I know that these are fixed expenses and they stay the same regardless of how many units I sell because I'm still within the relevant range. I haven't been told that I'm not, so I assume that I am. Gives me $6,000 in net operating income. The other way that I can do it is I can say, all right, 30. How did I get 30? Well, if we look at the prior problem over here, we said that break even was 400 bikes. 430, this is 30 bikes beyond the break even point, right? 400 minus the 430 gives us the 30. And then I can multiply that times 200, which is my contribution margin per unit. And then that gives me $6,000 net operating income. So basically the way I can do this is if I am beyond the break even point, this is important. If I'm beyond the break even point, my net operating income will increase by the amount of contribution margin. If I am beyond the break even point, my net operating income will increase by the amount of contribution margin. Am I beyond the break even point? Yes. How many bikes beyond the break even point am I? 30 times my contribution margin per unit gives me $6,000, which is my increase in contribution margin from break even. Remember, contribution margin was $80,000 at break even. Here it's 86. So the difference is $6,000 in contribution margin. And that is also my increase in net operating income. And it is also not just the increase, but it is the net operating income because I am beyond the break even point. Okay, so what do I keep saying that beyond the break-even point? That's something that I said in some prior lecture videos. That I said net operating income will increase by the amount of contribution margin for each unit sold. Look, it's exactly what we found. 30 additional units beyond the break-even point times the contribution margin per unit, $6,000 in contribution margin, which is also the increase in net operating income. Why is this so? This is so because, look, remember, if this is 80,000, this is 0. That's my break-even point. Any additional contribution margin here comes down to here. So if this is $86,000, which is what contribution margin would be at 430 bikes, remember, 430 times the 200 gives us the 86,000 right here, minus our fixed cost of 80,000 gives us 6,000. Why is that also the increase? Well, what is net operating income at break even? It's 0. 86 minus the 80 gives us 6,000. Net operating income is 6,000. when we sell 430 bikes, but the increase from 0 to 6,000 is also 6,000. Why is this so? Again, because after we have broken even, we have generated enough contribution margin to cover our fixed costs. 80,000, enough contribution margin to cover our fixed costs. Any additional contribution margin, then this number becomes bigger, this number stays the same, therefore this number, net operating income, becomes bigger. So any contribution margin beyond the break-even point, at break-even we've already covered our fixed costs, that becomes additional net operating income. Okay, that's why this trick works. Now, that's an application of cost volume profit analysis right over here. And also same with break even. Okay, when you solve these problems, you can do it the long way, the medium shortcut way, or the short shortcut way. Either which way you get the same answer. But you still have to understand the concept of contribution margin, because on exams I could ask you to calculate contribution margin. But you can always come back to doing it the long way if you want to. Okay? Now, basically doing it the long way, and this way over here, is looking at the profit equation. So the profit equation says profit equals sales price times our quantity sold minus our variable expenses times our quantity sold minus our total fixed costs. Or what I can do is I put X and then I called it Q. Sometimes you see Q for quantity, sometimes you see X for the quantity, sometimes you see fixed costs as TFC, sometimes you just see it as F, sometimes you see it as FC, so I'm using different symbols here, okay? But it's still the same thing. So what I did is I factored out sales price minus variable costs, and I just multiplied it times X, and I called it Q. Q for quantity, or X for level of activity. That's the same thing, okay? Sales price minus variable costs times quantity minus my fixed costs. Now, this sales price minus my variable expenses per unit, that's what this is. Sales price minus my variable expenses per unit, that equals contribution margin. So contribution margin times Q minus fixed costs equals our profit. Now, when we looked at break even before, remember, what is profit at break even? It's 0. So if we were to apply this formula right over here to break even, let's look at that. 0 equals CM times Q minus fixed costs. Therefore, fixed costs equals CM times my quantity. Therefore, fixed costs divided by my contribution, this is contribution margin per unit, by the way, equals quantity at break even. And that's what we did when we took our 80,000, which is our fixed costs, divided by our $200 of CM per unit. That gives us our quantity at break even. Okay? So now let's come over here and take a look at our contribution margin ratio. So our contribution margin ratio is equal to contribution margin divided by total sales. Or if this is on a unit basis, unit contribution margin divided by our unit selling price. Okay? What this is telling you is how much contribution margin do you get for $1 of sales? How much contribution margin do you get for each dollar of sales? That's what the CM ratio is telling you. So when you look at our RBC bicycle, what would be the contribution margin ratio based on total sales? I'll come back over here to page 179, and I take my 100,000 divided by my 250. .4 or 40%, or 40 cents of contribution margin. I get 40 cents of contribution margin for every dollar of sales. Now I can also do that on the unit basis if I want to, but all I have to do is just take my unit contribution margin divided by my unit selling price, and I got that 200 from right here, and I got my unit selling price right there. It's the same thing, and it's the same thing because RBC Bicycle, which is our working example, only sells one type of bike. If we sold multiple bikes, the total contribution margin would be different from the unit because we have two different units, bike A and bike B, for example. And they could have two different contribution margins and two different sales prices. Therefore, they have different CM ratios, and then that would mean the unit would not necessarily be equal to the total. Okay? I want you to pause the lecture video and I want you to do this problem. Okay? And I'm going to show you a couple different ways to solve this problem. Okay? Hello and welcome. So let's see how you did. So we increased sales from 400 to 500 bikes. At 400 bikes, we have sales at 200,000. How did I get that? $500 per bike times the 400 bikes. Variable expenses at 120, 400 bikes times the $300 per bike. That gives us contribution margin of 80,000. Fixed costs stay the same. Net operating income is zero. Remember, 400 bikes was break even. At 500 bikes, we have that right over here. Okay, so we have that 20,000. So that means our CM went from 80,000 to 100,000, which is an increase of contribution margin of 20,000. That also happens to be the increase in net operating income, 20,000. And the reason that is because at 500 bikes, we're beyond the break even. So remember what I was talking about before is that once you go beyond the break even, any contribution margin beyond the break even is net operating income. And we can see that right there. That's one option to solve this problem, is to do comparative income statements like this. Another option to solve this problem would be to say, all right, sales dollars at 500 bikes is 250,000. Sales dollars at 400 bikes is 200,000. That means I have an increase in sales dollars of $50,000. Now, I could use the CM ratio to figure out how much contribution margin I get from an increase in sales of 50,000. Because remember what this is telling you. This says I get 40 cents of contribution margin for every dollar of sales. Well, if I have an increase in sales of $50,000 and I get 40 cents of contribution margin for every dollar of sales, I can multiply 50,000 times 0.4, which gives me my 20,000, which is my increase in contribution margin, which also happens to be my increase in net operating income. So the thing about the problems in this chapter is that there's multiple ways to solve these problems. You can do it the long way, or you could do it the shortcut way. But this way says this way was a lot faster, because this way I had to write out all this. This way I said, I know that 0.4 means that I get 40 cents of contribution margin for every dollar of sales. An extra $50,000 of sales times a 0.4 gives me 20,000, which is my increase, is how much contribution margin I get from this additional sales. And therefore, that's the increase in contribution margin. And I'm taking it a step further by saying that's also the increase in net operating income because I'm beyond the break even. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture video now, and in the next lecture videos will be more applications of cost, volume, profit analysis. Thank you.